All right, we are ready to get started. So thank you all for being here again. I hope you all enjoyed the film. Can you let Jason know what you thought of the film? So I will now turn it over to Jason Berry and Dr. Michael White.
Thank you, thank you. This is going to prove to be one of the most important films on New Orleans and New Orleans culture. Because a lot of times when you see movies about New Orleans, you see something about Bourbon Street or the French Quarter or something commercialized. But this is authentic New Orleans culture of the past and present. And it's so important that this film captured many things that are rare, like the more traditional brass band playing in parades. It's changed quite a lot in recent decades. But also a number of the people that were interviewed and shown in the film were no longer with us. And some of them had not been interviewed on camera much before or at all. So it was very important that all of this was captured and preserved for perpetuity. And, I was very honored to have an important role in the film. Not only was I a talking head, but and seen performing in funerals and parades, but also, I was able to help along with the production and be a consultant, but also more important, to contribute a lot of the music. I wrote the closing theme that was sung by one of our well-known local singers, John Boutte. And I wrote a number of songs that were used there, but also some of the songs were taken from recordings that I did. And so as you can see, there was quite a transformation. Some of us, when we started the film, were quite young. And when we finished the film, we're a little older. But, it's very important that some of the things that you see in this film, like, for example, the Congo Square reenactment, okay? And the discussion about Congo Square, you don't see that kind of thing done in a film, and certainly not on that level. It's extremely important because Congo Square is like one of the foundations of New Orleans music. That's where we get the concept of Africanized or African style celebrations, even though they're transformed. But those things influence all of the original New Orleans music, from jazz to brass bands, jazz funerals, social club parades, the Mardi Gras Indians that you saw there. All of those things were greatly influenced by African traditions that you saw in Congo Square. So it was great to see that also depicted in the film. So in a sense, as you can tell, it was pretty much a history of New Orleans as seen through its cultural traditions. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the producer, Jason Berry, and see what he would like to say.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be with all of you. I'm sorry I have to do it from a distance, but with the miracle of technology, here we are. This film only took about 22 years to finish. I started shooting in the late 90s with Ford Foundation support. The interviews with Dr. White, I can see some of the paintings now in the room. What a beautiful environment you have. Michael White, Greg Stafford, and several of the other people in the film were originally the people who sort of alerted me to who originally alerted me to the tension between continuity and change, the way in which the drug culture was rattling, so to speak, the beauty of this funeral tradition. So that became a theme that I decided to follow as we worked very hard to get the funding for the film. But at this point, I think I should really stop and pay tribute to the person who is not here and yet is in all of our hearts, and that's Deb Cotton. When Deb came to work on the production, I guess it was 2015, she had, of course, by that time been in recovery, so to speak, from the terrible shooting for a couple of years. And her death was so unexpected. We knew that she was, having issues, and that she was working very hard to sustain the recovery. As you see in the film, she was even giving speeches and filming at some of the parades. But in the end, her health just could not sustain it. And that threw us into quite a personal or collective crisis, I guess, for everybody involved in the film. We loved her. We adored her. She was part of our team. And then we had to film her funeral. And then after we filmed her funeral, we had to decide where this fit in the visual narrative as we were editing and constructing it. And then, of course, COVID hit. So, just to go back a few years, when Katrina hit, it just completely upset the whole storyline for the film. Dr. White, as you saw, lost his house. And, I was in Plano, Texas at my sister-in-law's house. Everyone, had evacuated. When I finally connected with him, he was in Houston. This was just weeks after the flood. And he told me that going on Google Maps, he realized his house had been inundated. And I said, well, if you're going back anytime soon, I'd like to film you. And he agreed, for which I was quite grateful. But as I think of Deb, her spirit is really a sort of galvanizing presence in this film. And so it was a great honor to know her, to work with her, and to have her in this film as a sort of memory artist whose contribution goes, I think, well beyond the life that she led. The Congo Square sequence took a great many months to plan and to execute. We had all kinds of financial issues, as most independent films do. But I think for now, it's probably best for me to turn it back over to Michael. And at some point, when you all have questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Jason. We've been showing the film around the country. Actually, it's been shown in Europe a few times as well. And hopefully we'll see this on a major network soon. We'll see what happens. But I think that one of the issues that many of us had struggled with in New Orleans and New Orleans culture was what Jason mentioned, that sort of tension between continuity and change in not only traditional music, but the traditions themselves, such as the jazz funerals. You hear about jazz funerals and most people think that funerals were only given for old deceased musicians. But in reality, the majority of funerals throughout most of the 20th century were given for deceased members of the Black social aid and pleasure clubs, because, dues-paying members in good standing many times requested a funeral. And today, there's still a lot of jazz funerals. Most of the jazz funerals are a bit different. When you saw the secrets about Danny Barker not wanting a traditional funeral, it was because he disapproved of the changes that occurred in the funeral tradition. As they say, it became rowdy in a lot of different ways, and the music was different, and the behavior, the attire, all of that. But they still have rare, occasional, traditional jazz funerals. I played a funeral maybe about a month ago for a member of the organization that was seen in the film, The Black Men of Labor. One of their members died, and he was given a traditional jazz funeral. So we still have those, but they're becoming more and more rare because there are fewer musicians that actually know how to play the traditional style. I mean, the second lines still go on, and brass bands still go on, thriving, in fact, more than ever. But the style is very different, and the purpose is very different from what it had been throughout most of the tradition. Jason, anything else?
I'm
before we
sorry.
open it up? Anything else you'd like to add before we open it up?
Oh, yeah, there is something I want to say. Um, you know, I came after many years of research to view funerals with music, the term of the musicians before television, uh, as caravans of memory. Each one of I've probably been to, I don't know, a good 100, 150 over the years. I've filmed, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20. But what I came to see is that each funeral, in a sense, was kind of like an urban short story. You know, it locked into the story of a family, oftentimes a church, part of a neighborhood, part of a city. And between the sermons, and the songs and the stories, I mean, this is a great storytelling tradition of the city. And I wanted, particularly in the book I did, as well as the film, I think there are copies of the book, City of a Million Dreams. And I would add that the longest chapter in the book is a profile of Dr. Michael White. So if you appreciate his role and want to read more, please get a copy. I'm sorry I can't be there to sign. But you know, as I got to know many of the musicians Michael references, I came to appreciate how the stories they told were part of a historical consciousness of capturing the meaning of the city at a time when the white newspapers treated African Americans as, you know, marginal people. Their stories are not really that important. And yet, here you find, going through old files and libraries and archives, one of the things I kept finding as I did all this research, I can't tell you how many times I saw a headline saying jazz funerals, a dying tradition. And then you'd go to another part of the newspaper and you'd read the obituaries for the day. And well, here's a member of Zulu, the crew of Zulu, who has died, and all members are invited to come at 4:00. So this was a quiet drama of freedom rising that rose through streets of the city over many decades, in spite of segregation, in spite of the often vicious and violent backlash of the police or the White Citizens Council, as you saw in that sequence on Mr. Eli, Lolis Eli, the great civil rights attorney. I remember as a kid sitting in the living room with my parents, who supported integration, and we watched the demonstrations at City Hall where those people are yelling 2468, we don't want to integrate. As Deb Cotton says in the film, those memories are very real in the lives of people today, Black people particularly, but I remember that quite forcefully as part of my childhood. So I think what we tried to do in the film, and it's really the same thing I tried to do in the book, is to capture that history of a city that has an often beguiling personality. And to me, the fundamental story of New Orleans, and I've done 10 books now and a lot of investigative reporting on other topics, but to me, the core narrative is how a culture of memory rooted in the dances of enslaved Africans at that public park called Congo Square kept pushing against a city of laws that for most of our history until the 1960s was anchored in white supremacy. And of course, some of the court decisions today still reflect that, sadly. But I think there is hope in a culture with such resilience and such a commitment to memory and honoring those, who have departed, but are still a part of that spiritual sensibility that we all carry. So one quick note on Danny Barker. He was a wonderful guy, and we tried to get more footage of him talking into the film, but as some of you perhaps who have worked on documentaries know, you're constantly cutting, you're constantly trying to figure out how much can we fit into the time we have for this film before the credits. So I just want to give you all one great story that he told me. He said one time, you're really interested in how we bury people, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I think it's very important. He said, well, when I was a boy, I lived in the 7th Ward, and my auntie took me to Sadie Brown's house. And everybody knew that her husband, Willie Brown, was still in the parlor. And he died 30 years before. And what happened was the family took him to a Chinaman. They took out his body parts, they tanned him down, and they stuffed him. It was like a taxidermist. And so he was living in that room, staying in that room with her for 30 years until she died, and then they buried them both. When you get stories like that, you really come to appreciate that you're living in a rare place in the latitudes. One other quick tale, Danny told me, I interviewed him 5 months before he died, before he had announced that he had cancer, and he was sitting in my living room. I mean, we were very good friends, and I learned an enormous amount through that friendship. And I said to him, you have really done everything. He was 84 at the time. I said, you have traveled the world. You've recorded with everyone from Armstrong and even Charlie Parker to Winton and Dr. John. And you and Blue Lou, his wife, you and Blue Lou have had this long career together. And you've published 2 books. And I'm just curious, though, what is the secret of sustaining a marriage for 63 years? And he looked at me with these bedroom eyes and this short, little mustache. He said, well, you go to mass, you listen to the priest, and you say your vows, and you go on about your business. And I said, so that's it. You say your vows, you hunker down, and 63 years later, you're still married. And he said, no, you have to give her the money. Did I get any laugh there or not? Anyway, we'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, let me say one other thing before we do. I grew up at a time, thinking about something Jason said, I grew up at a time when segregation was very much alive and well in New Orleans. And sometimes growing up was very confusing and difficult in the city. Things like, churches, like if you went to Catholic church, it was segregated. I was a child and we could only sit in the last 2 pews that said colored. Well, as a child, I thought it was kind of cool that we had reserved seats. But, we used to have to sit in the back of the bus, and if somebody put a screen, a white person came and put a screen back, you had to get up and sit behind. So I would always ask my mother, what were all these things going on? And her answer was always, because we're colored. So I never could figure that out. So I had to figure it out on my own. So get up, behind us. I thought it was a game like musical chairs or something, But it was a very difficult time. And when I came along and discovered the jazz tradition, I was 20 years old. I almost missed it. And, everybody in New Orleans does not know about this. New Orleans is like a head of lettuce, and there are many different layers of culture. You peel back one layer, but there are other layers. The Mardi Gras Indian thing is one thing. The second line community is another thing. Certain uptown Creole thing, downtown Creole. There are many, many different layers of culture, very rich layers of culture. So I was 20 years old. I almost missed this tradition, but when I discovered it, I found out that this was a way of celebrating freedom, a way of celebrating life, a way of coming together. And it made things make sense to me. It was a way of resisting. It was a way of enjoying things. Now, this tradition, when I started playing in the mid-1970s, was still almost an underground tradition that a lot of people in New Orleans didn't even know existed. It wasn't in the news, it wasn't in the papers, on TV, wasn't in documentaries. And when I joined this tradition, I was amazed. I didn't know that this had been going on in New Orleans. It was almost exclusively Black. You didn't see any white people, but thousands of Black people. And it was an amazing tradition. Now it's opened up quite a bit. But what that was all about was celebration of heritage, of culture, of freedom, of resistance, resilience in life. And that was a beautiful tradition. And that changed, my whole life. So again, to have this tradition explained in a film is a great thing, and I think something that the world can learn from. So with that, we would like to open the floor for questions.
We'd love to take questions from the audience, if you know. Okay.
Hello, Dr. White, a fabulous film. Just a quick question. Who inspired you, or what inspired you to start the clarinet?
Oh, well, I didn't know, even though I came from a musical family that goes back to the beginning of jazz, I didn't know about that until I got involved in jazz. But when I was growing up, we lived in the same house with my aunt, and she had been a music major in college. She had won a clarinet instrumental scholarship to Xavier University. And so she realized in a couple of years, there's not much a Black woman is going to do with a clarinet in the 1940s. So she became an elementary school teacher. But she used to pull out her rusty old clarinet and her crumbling music book 2 or 3 times a year, and she would play. And I loved the sound of the instrument and the joy that she had on her face. It just seemed like it transformed her life into, this happiness. So I wanted to have that kind of joy. And then when I was a kid, we used to always go at least to Mardi Gras parades. And some of the high school bands were, like, in particular, St. Augustine High School, where you saw it in the film, and I eventually went. I mean, right now, St. Augustine High School is performing in Paris, France. So it's a very popular high school marching band in New Orleans. And when I saw them, I had never seen Black kids look so strong and so powerful. They have the nickname is the Purple Knights, and they had night uniforms on, and they would march up the street, and people would open up, and they had, the marching 100 of them, and they were so powerful and so strong, and I wanted to be a part of that because I had never seen anything like that, So yeah, so that's how I got into playing the clarinet. So I went to St. Augustine, took lessons from the band director, and the rest is history.
Not so much a question rather than an observation. I have a lot of firsthand experience with New Orleans. And what I love about this film that almost any other film I've seen, except for J'étais au bal, which was how you managed to capture the rich complexity of the New Orleans culture. You zeroed in on 1 or 2 topics, but in a way, I think everyone in this room, no matter how much we know about New Orleans, you made it even more clear how deep and rich and really almost bottomless the culture of New Orleans is. And when you get to the bottom, it comes right back up. And so really, it's a big thank you, because you really did tackle something without missing the point, which is the depth of New Orleans. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, I have another one that's not a question, but a comment, and I just want to point everybody here. This is a wonderful film. And I happen to have just seen another wonderful film called Guardians of the Flame that deals with the Harrison family and what they're doing to keep the culture of the Mardi Gras Indians and also work with you, the community. And if you're here in San Francisco through tomorrow night at midnight, you can stream that as part of the San Francisco Dog Fest. And I really encourage you to do that.
San Francisco what?
San Francisco Dog Fest. Guardians of the Flame. It's a remarkable family, and you really get an appreciation of the indigenous art form as well.
And for any jazz fans out there, one of the chiefs and the son of Chief Harrison is Donald Harrison, the famous modern jazz alto saxophonist who, you know, plays all over. And last year, in fact, we played together in this area. We were in Healdsburg at the Jazz Fest. Yeah.
I want to thank both of you for making this film. It's really unique, and I was just in New Orleans in March. Stanford Black alumni had their summit there, so they brought out the St. Augustine High School band, and a lot of us didn't even know anything about it, and so that was a true revelation. So I do have a question. It's actually, there's two questions. One is kind of pretty straightforward, but what is the origin of the term second line? You know, where did that come from? And is there anything else like that in the world that happens? And it's a little reminiscent of Candomblé and the Festival de Boa Morte in Cachoeira in Brazil, which I happened to be there when it was happening one year. But I just want to ask about that. Obviously, it has African origins, but it seems fairly distinctive.
Well, Congo Square. The second line, the term second line refers to the crowd that follows a social club parade or a funeral. And they, you know, like you come out here and you see the Rose Bowl parade or something, you stand up and look at it, oh, that's pretty, and you go home. In New Orleans, you become part of the parade. So a crowd of anonymous people that could be hundreds or in some cases thousands of people follow alongside the parade and they dance. And they're called the second line because the first line of order is the band and the social club divisions. So that's the second line, the line on the sides of the band. And they dance along and they do this African-derived dance. You know, and it's very creative and all of that. Yeah, West Africa. I mean, there are certain West African, you go to Ghana, Senegal, there's film footage of this, where if you turn off the music, you would think New Orleans and you'd think it was the same thing. You see colorful umbrellas, you see people dancing similar dances, waving handkerchiefs or cloths, you know, following alongside the main procession, all of that. So in New Orleans, we think we invented that, but we didn't. It comes from West Africa, but transformed. You see, as it mixed with other cultures, it transformed into something very unique. So you see somewhat similar things in some other parts of the African diaspora, but New Orleans, we're pretty unique. We've developed our own version of different things.
You know, there's an academic term called danced memory, which applies to a great many cultures throughout the African diaspora. And I think it's most pronounced in New Orleans, at least in North America, because of the role of Congo Square, the park, as you saw in the film, where enslaved Africans were able to transplant the burial choreographies of the mother culture, because the original dances, the ring dances, were rituals of memory and homage to the ancestors. Sterling Stuckey, an esteemed historian, in fact, I think he taught, and maybe still does for many years, at Northside, University of California, Northridge, maybe? Anyway, he has a book, Slave Culture, terrific book. And in the very beginning, he points out that everywhere the ring dance was performed in the early years of enslavement in North America, these folks were performing memory rituals of the ancestors. And, as we showed in the film, after Congo Square ended after the Civil War, the ring, in a sense, opened out, and the dancers began flowing behind the linear procession of brass bands. So in a sense, the story of the city is really distilled into the coming together of the ring and the line.
And an interesting thing that I've noticed in a number of second lines, without any discussion or impromptu, sometimes when the second line slows down or stops, the members of the club will still form a ring and dance in and outside of the circle. So talk about cultural memory.
Thank you.
And thanks for this great film. It was really amazing. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I'm not a musicologist or an anthropologist or anything. I lived in Zimbabwe in Southern Africa for 2 years, and it just struck me, they have a thing they call burial societies. They use that word in English, but they kind of do the same thing. It used to be an apartheid system, and Black people couldn't have insurance, so people paid a certain amount every month. And when somebody died, everybody in the society, in the whole neighborhood would come together, and it's just interesting parallel. My question is, did I catch it right in the film that second lines used to be illegal or something, that they fought them or something?
Well, I would put it this way, and I spent quite a long time going through as many of the old newspapers as I could find, trying to understand the reports when second lines, the term was not yet in use. For example, in the late 19th century, they would refer to Negroes marching or parading behind a band. And sometimes you'd read accounts of young white men who would come out and try to beat them off the street. I mean, Bruce Raven refers to this in the film. But the accounts of these collisions are pretty clear in meaning. They didn't want Black people, quote, taking over the streets. What you find in the early 20th century, say by about 1915, is that white organizations began cutting back on having funerals with music. And the reason they didn't want to do it was because they did not want to attract second liners parading behind them. And so what evolves from roughly the end of the Second World War well into the 1930s, 1940s is a tradition of the social aid and pleasure clubs coming out for funerals that sometimes have 4,000 and 5,000 people going through streets of the city. And the cops didn't really know what to do about this. I mean, these were religious rituals, and they didn't want to go out and with billy clubs just start, beating on people. And yet there was such a, and you find this in many of the memoirs of the early century musicians. Armstrong talks about this, Sidney Bechet, a great many others. But the streets of the city became a kind of stage for these performances of memory. And they gained a great deal of momentum in spite of the segregation laws. And that's not to say there weren't violent altercations, but I think one has to see it as a broad sort of flowing river of memory.
And growing up under segregation, it was It's very hard to explain, but a very spiritually powerful thing to be in this massive sea of people. There was a certain strength, and you saw a transformation that seemed to transcend race, racism, modern times, financial status, education. It was a thing that sort of unified everyone, and it brought you to another place, a place of joy, a place of true freedom, a place of togetherness. I got to meet a lot of people in second lines I normally would not have met, and we shared a certain kind of bond, all kinds of people, and that bond came through the music and through the dancing, which fed each other as creative parallels.
Thank you. That was amazing. I learned a whole lot. Things that I didn't know about New Orleans. I thought I knew quite a bit. And it's also to see somebody who I haven't seen in years, Fred Johnson, who I'm gonna write him when I get back to a computer. So I guess I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this question about how to keep the tradition alive and to rejuvenate it with new people, and what happens to get younger people into it. But the other part of the question is, I'm glad you mentioned this is a good dancing in Cachoeira, Brazil. That tradition is kind of it doesn't change. I mean, it's sort of like it's the people who are leading it, not directed, and there might be some tensions between like younger people who wanting, like some aspect of it, but wanting to contribute their more contemporary features into it. And what kind of discussions have there been about that? If I make my question sensible. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important question. I came along at the very tail end of when the authentic traditional style dominated in social club parades, church parades, and jazz funerals. The church parade tradition, as was seen in the film, as it was, is now extinct. You don't have brass bands playing traditional jazz versions of hymns in church parades anymore. But a lot of things happened that caused changes just about the time when I started to come into the tradition. And one of those things was a lot of the musicians in the traditional brass bands were getting old and, too old to do street parades. Some of them were now doing this new phenomenon that came along on Sundays, the same day as the social club parades, called jazz brunches. And to be inside of an air-conditioned jazz brunch for 3 hours as opposed to 6 hours back then in the second line, hot, sometimes dangerous. Yeah, and paid a lot better in the hotels. So, and then also a lot of the older musicians started to tour and travel, playing at festivals in places outside of the city. So that took some of the older people off the street, as well as, of course, attrition. A lot of them died out or just got too old and sick to be in parades. So what happened in the 70s, there were two general trends. One was that a few younger guys played the traditional style, like myself, but other guys in my age group and a little younger they weren't familiar with the traditional. They had come up in high school bands, which are very popular in New Orleans, and they would kind of hang around and they developed their own thing. And so the first major group that did that, even though it was an evolution, but the first group that became popular by changing everything was a group known as the Dirty Dozen. The Dirty Dozen is going to be here next week, I think, in the LA area performing. But anyway, they changed everything forever. The style of the music, some of the basic instrumentations. They stopped wearing the uniforms that brass bands would wear. They started wearing T-shirts and different things. But their music was revolutionary. It was new, it was hot, it was fresh. It captured the spirit of the older tradition. It was a completely different thing. And then other groups followed along because the Dirty Dozen became successful. They innovated a lot of things, like, for example, playing regularly in nightclubs. Brass bands were for parades, but they started playing regularly in nightclubs and things like that. So other groups like the Rebirth Brass Band came along and became very popular and successful as well. And that kind of changed, you know, the nature, and more changes came with the younger brass band movement. When I started playing in brass bands, they had at most 4 or 5 brass bands, and that was it. And maybe an occasional pickup brass band. Now there are dozens of brass bands, but 99% of them are in the more modern style. And it's unfortunate in a sense because, you know, we were taught whether we played in the heart of the community, in the ghetto, uptown, for rich people, for the poorest of people, it meant a lot, your attire, because you were, you know, an example of musicianship, which meant a lot, and you were representing your community and yourself. Okay, and so all of those things were important, as you saw in the film. Nowadays, you know, and there are a lot of reasons, which I won't go into all of that right now, but a lot of times what you see presented as New Orleans brass bands are people dressed any kind of way, street clothes, hardly any clothes, acting any kind of way, playing any kind of way, just making noise. Some of the modern brass bands are very good, but some of them are just, you know, and unfortunately, what happened in the 1960s and 70s was the brass band tradition became sort of commercialized. Instead of just playing for Black community events, they started to use them to travel outside to advertise the city. And they started using the brass bands for television commercials and greetings of dignitaries at airports and, you know, the Super Bowl and James Bond movies and all these kinds of things. Well, all of that brought about a lot of changes in the tradition that kind of led to the modern brass band tradition. So to answer your question, it's very difficult because, you know, we live in a tourist-oriented city. A lot of people, you know, come to New Orleans, anything goes, they're happy to be there, you know, anything you hear. And so it's very difficult to maintain certain kinds of musical standards and tradition. So that's kind of tough, you know, because a lot of the younger brass bands are successful just doing anything. So it's a tough thing. We try to.
Do you like it?
Do I like it?
Yeah, what is your opinion about that?
Some of it, yes. I mean, I work with a couple of the younger brass bands to try to teach them to at least try to incorporate some aspects of the tradition, musical aspects as well as others. Like, for example, the Hot 8 brass band and the TCB brass band. You know, I've done stuff with them, recorded with them, stuff like that. So I've been kind of like a mentor to some of them, but it's very difficult. It's a confusing world because, like I said, once again, you know, you don't have to learn about the tradition when you have, you know, half inebriated tourists from God knows where going, that's the greatest thing I ever heard, you know. You know, you don't have to learn, develop, grow, but in the community, you had to. Because if the music wasn't right, if it wasn't good, you didn't look right, play right, act right, you know, the older guys would mentor you. But now that mentoring system doesn't exist as much as it used to, you know. So you have groups like the Dirty Dozen that developed a high level of what they do, and the Rebirth Brass Band, and a few others, you know, but then you have others.
Not so much of a question as like a statement. Well, first of all, thanks for making this film. It was great. I loved it. And I've only been in New Orleans once. And I love this city and I love the history of it. I have friends who go every year. 2 of them are here right now. And I just want to thank you for making this film because I try to learn and both learns as much as I can. And this film really taught me a lot more about the history and the music and everything. And it makes me appreciate the city a lot more. And for anybody, if there's anybody here who has never been there, you definitely have to go there. It's a great city. And so, like I said, I want to thank you again for making this film. It was
Thank you.
great.
I have a question for Jason. Jason, when you made the film, did you realize that this was going to be a film that a lot of people would say that it taught them a lot about New Orleans?
I, I was so immersed in trying to finish the film, and you know, I guess I don't know how to answer that, Michael. That's a good question.
You sound like my
Well, you know, when you're right in the middle of something, and there are so many different moving parts to it, you're not thinking 5 years ahead. Oh, gee, what's it going to be like when, you know, we're showing at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, and somebody asked me a hard question like that. I don't know. I'd have to. I guess what I wanted to tell the story of the city in a way that had not been done before. And, you know, New Orleans is a terrific town. It's a break your heart town at times. It's a celebratory place. Everybody has a certain piece of it. And I was just fascinated by these funerals because I got to tell you, you know, I did a lot of investigative reporting about the Catholic Church. I've done 3 major books, and I would come back. Oh, this is from roughly maybe 2009 to about 2015. I'd come back from these trips to Rome, writing about all this corruption. And mind you, I went to Jesuit schools. And that plane would come down, and I would feel like the soggy soil of the city was coming up to possess me again and take me. And within a few days, I would be at a funeral. And oftentimes, as a journalist, I went because it was someone I knew. I had a column for many years, music column. And every time I sat in those churches, I felt people expressing a closeness to God by transcending suffering. And I didn't get that feeling sitting in these beautiful Renaissance churches in Rome. It's not to put down the beauty of the Catholic churches or the Catholic imagination, but I learned so much at those funerals about myself and about values. And the more I followed it, the more I just wanted to get it out, both in a book and because of all the footage in a film. So honestly, Michael, I was only thinking about trying to finish it and sell it.
Okay.
No, I think that was nice.
Any last questions or comments? Yeah, thank you. This was such a love story for all of us who love New Orleans deeply, and it really comes across. And I hope you get mass distribution. I want everyone to see it. But I wanted to say that, and I hope it's done with the utmost respect, but I too experienced that joy and that levity of being part of the second line, and in my own loss and in loss from some of my friends who have lost people. We've adopted that tradition of celebrating and moving them on, and it is the most healing, beautiful sense of community, and it works. Yeah, it really works. So I think that was a wonderful storyline. You know, the history part of me wants to ask a lot more about these social clubs, and I see the historical reasons for why they were created, and I am maybe another time or another book, but, I love.
I have quite a historical treatment of the burial societies, social aid and pleasure clubs in the book, if you want to read it.
Okay, nice, good play. For sale downstairs.
I am gonna say just real quick that, yes, when my mom passed away 14 years ago here in California, we did a second line for her at her celebration of life. And then 3 of our crew who go to New Orleans every year or live there, fathers died all within the same year. So we had the Bug Stompers play for us, and we did a second line for them. And I'll tell you, the first time I ever saw it, I said, man, when I go, that's the way I want to go. So I'm hoping everyone hears that. Okay, thank you again very much.
Anybody else? Right.
Hi there, just wanted to again say thank you for the film. My question is about cultural impact. You may be able to tell from my accent, I'm not American, I'm Australian. I'm just visiting here, and a lot of the themes I saw in the film, actually, I connected with in seeing in Aboriginal cultures in Australia. I've studied and practiced in some rural areas with some Aboriginal communities, and they have what's called sorry business, which is, again, there's days of funeral proceedings laden with, culture and tradition, which has also undergone, very tough times because of colonisation, and my communities expressed a lot of resilience. And with my own eyes, I can see how a lot of African American culture has actually impacted Aboriginal Australians and their story of resilience as well. And I was just wondering, I know you said it's hard to sort of verbalize what impact you wanted for the film, but in terms of its impact outside of America, is there anything that you could see, this film having an impact on other, cultures or, disempowered peoples?
Well, we showed it in Paris at the Musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, which is the old Musée de l'Homme, the great anthropological museum of Paris. We had a full house. Everybody seemed to like it. They stayed. In fact, they stayed so long, we had to leave. We shut the place down. I think, and we're showing it, in fact, the Italian subtitles are being put on as we speak for a festival in Florence, African Diaspora Cinema, at the end of July. Unfortunately, I wish I could go, but I can't. We showed it at the Dock and Roll Festival in London. Again, had a full house, and people stayed, for more than an hour, almost the length of the film, hour and a half. I think, in all modesty, I believe this is a universal story, and I think it has resonance beyond the United States. And certainly listening to your reflections on Australia, which I have never had the pleasure to visit, but of course I've read a fair amount. I think that the idea of celebrating death is an idea that is circulating through a kind of collective unconscious, because the comments that one hears as we show the film, especially by people from foreign countries who are either living in the United States or just traveling, indicate to me that with all the darkness that surrounds us in the news, and I don't have to go down a checklist. You guys, everyone in the room, I know, has the the same sense of foreboding, especially with climate change. And I think it's part of a sort of psychological reality that goes beyond national borders, that we want some meaning out of life, something that carries. And whether one is religious or not, whether one is a believer or not, the idea of death as a sort of spiritual stage, I think, has a great attraction.
Well, thank you so much, Jason and Dr. White, for giving us your time in this beautiful film. And thank you, all of you, for staying for quite a bit, almost an hour and a half as well. And I do want to just remind everyone, the book, which contains much more information, is downstairs at the MoAD store for sale, so go pick up a copy.
Did we buy the film?
Not yet. Not yet, I'm afraid, but that's coming, I promise you.
All right.
Keep checking the website for the film, you'll find out.
Okay.
So thank you all for coming and spending your afternoon here at MoAD. We love having you here. Please do take a moment to access our online program survey and give us your feedback. If you like what we do, we would love to have you as members of the museum, or just tell all your friends and come back again. We have a lot of different programs. You can find what we're doing on moadsf.org. And I would want to just one more time thank our generous sponsors for today, Kaiser Permanente and the Uruguayan Community Benefit District. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jason.
Okay, Elizabeth, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll talk. Bye.
Okay, take good care. Thank you.